afternoon session. I'm very happy to introduce the next amazing speaker, Maurice Herlihy. He is a professor at Brown University, and he's well known for his work that helped to lay the foundation of multiprocessor synchronization and the theory of distributed computing. And for his amazing works, he has won numerous distinctions. He is the recipient of the Dijkstra Prize in distributed computing in 2003 for his work on weight-free synchronization. And then in 2004, he received the Gödel Prize for applying topology to the theory of distributed computing. In 2008, he received the ISCA Influential Paper Award. And then he received the Dijkstra Prize again in 2012 for his, this time for his work on transactional memory. And then in 2013, he received the Wallace McDowell Award. And so I'm going to give the floor to Maurice.
Thank you. So this is joint work with Barbara Liskov and Luba Shriera, who have agreed to handle any awkward or difficult questions should they arise. So the paper itself is currently lives on archive, but it'll appear in the next VLDB. Now, as you all know, distributed computing is often described in terms of adversaries. So you describe an algorithm, a system, or so on, in terms of the adversaries who are trying to cause mischief and how powerful they are and what they are allowed and not allowed to do. Now, classical distributed computing, the adversary is typically cute, in the sense it's fairly abstract, very limited. It can make control timing. What do you do if messages are late? What if they're out of order? What if your components crash? What if messages are lost? You think about, what would the adversary do in this particular case? Oh, we can fix it because, we do something or other. At the very limit, there's Byzantine failures, which aren't, although technically we say that they're malicious, but really we call them Byzantine because we're too lazy to enumerate all of the possible failure modes. But in some greater sense, we're not really worried about that there are gremlins attacking the sensors on an airplane wing. Really it's just kind of a shorthand for saying, we don't really know what the failure modes are, so we'll just assume that they're bad. Now, given this, we're given, against such an adversary, usually we're attacking very small, precisely stated technical problems like consensus, set agreement, renaming. There's 3 or 4 problems that people have built careers publishing PodC papers on different ways to solve these things. But everything is very constrained and small and precise and abstract. But since then, the world has changed, and our notion of the adversary has changed. So instead of having kind of unpredictable failures, there are actual people and agents who are causing problems. The nature of the attack, we're not worried. Beg pardon?
I resent the choice of language.
You don't like the Farsi? You should be flattered. Anyway, so the modern adversaries have more than one way of attacking, and they will attack you in ways you didn't anticipate. Byzantine failures, you say, well, we've got 8 bits and we don't know what value is coming in. In this case, we're worried about all kinds of subtle attacks. Examples are, side channel attacks. Things like SGX turns out to be vulnerable to all of these look-ahead caching effects, meltdown, Spectre, things like that. Rootkits. For blockchains, there's a whole repertoire of exotic attacks that people have devised. Some of these attacks were devised by people here. The world is a much more complicated a place. The kinds of attacks that you need to worry about are much more subtle and indirect. And the problems that we're trying to solve are much harder. We're not interested in doing consensus. We're interested in building a society. We want to build an economy. We want to build a bank, a company, and things like that. And so the world is much more complicated than it used to be. And we need to rethink how we think about distributed computing in the face of this kind of much more fearsome adversary than we're used to. So let me give you an example of something that we'd like to do. We call this adversarial commerce because we couldn't think of a more glamorous name. So here we have one party, Bob, who owns a theater and wants to sell tickets. Carol here wants to buy theater tickets. And Alice is a broker who is willing to make the market. And in return for a small commission, she will sell Bob's tickets to Carol. And this is an example of the kind of commerce that we would like to do. This is adversarial commerce because none of these parties know each other or trust each other. Yeah.
So you've defined a problem here that admits no fully asynchronous solution. Should we ignore that and pretend that tickets are good indefinitely, or is that actually an important aspect?
Oh, that's not an important aspect. This is just a kind of an example, and
So they're not tickets for a specific show. They're tickets that you can use any day.
Well, there's a specific show that's far enough in advance that we're not worried about. It could be synchronous or asynchronous. We're not interested in this example at kind of that level of detail. This is just an example of something where we have an intermediary. We have people. Bob and Carol don't deal with each other directly. They go through Alice, and any implementation would probably be synchronous. But that's not the level at which I want to worry about this problem. So they want to do a deal. And the deal is pretty much what you would expect in this context. So Carol has 101 Bitcoin. So she gives them to Alice. Alice takes her one Bitcoin commission and forwards it to Bob. And then Bob sends back the tickets. And then everyone is happy. So this is kind of the naive, abstract version of the kind of deal that we want to do. Now, of course, I'm papering over and skating over all kinds of complexities, traps, and so on. But ideally, this is the sort of thing we want to do. Now, before we go any further, I want to mention that this is not the same as a cross-chain swap. When we first started working on this, people said, "Oh, cross-chain swaps, we know how to do that. What's the fuss?" But this kind of deal cannot be expressed as a swap, and if you try, you'll end up with something that isn't a swap. The reason is that Alice is using Carol's money to pay Bob. So this is a hallowed principle of modern finance that you sell something you don't own. And by the time everything is straightened out, you end up with your commission. But if this were a swap, then Alice would have to have the money to buy the tickets in a swap, and then she would have to do another swap to sell it. But we're doing the entire thing as one sort of atomic unit. And so this is not a swap. This is, we're going to steal ideas from the atomic swap world right and left. But technically, this is not a swap.
So is swap a special case of your scenario, or are they incomparable?
A swap is a special case of what I want to talk about. Basically, a swap, you directly send an asset from one party to another. Here, there's indirection. I'd send you an asset and you send it to someone else, and the entire indirect thing is part of the deal. Yeah.
Is it somehow related to payment networks, like Lightning Network?
It's related, but not the same thing. Because payment networks are really sort of a series of kind of atomic, it's sort of series of hops, and then you kind of atomically. So this encompasses payment networks, but that isn't kind of the main thing that we're trying to do.
I guess I'm still slightly confused about the difference between this and an atomic swap, because you could do an atomic swap, but the coins end up split over two accounts. But here you're saying like A is a separate block.
Alice doesn't have any money when she starts out. She has nothing to swap with Bob to get those tickets.
Right, but Carol can pay a Bitcoin to Alice and 100 Bitcoins to Bob.
But why would she give Alice that money? Alice's role is to act as a broker. If Carol and Bob could deal together, they would cut out the middleman. You know, it's like you go to Airbnb and the owner will say, next time you come to town, talk to me directly. So, you know, modern commerce would crash to a halt.
Carol are anonymous to each other. They can't find out who each other are.
Yeah. Alice has no interest in introducing them to each other. And so, you know, this idea of kind of leveraging and selling things that you don't own and paying for it with money that you don't own is, you know, is a good thing, actually. Okay, what can go wrong here? Well, sort of all the obvious things could go wrong. So we could end up with Bob sends out his tickets and doesn't get paid. And again, you know, we're living in this libertarian paradise where there's no recourse. And so if this happens, you know, there's nothing Bob can do. He can't call the police because, you know, who knows who Alice and Carol actually are. Maybe they're the same person. So that's unacceptable. Symmetrically, you know, if Carol could be swindled and the others, you know, could take her money, you know, that's not considered an acceptable outcome. It could be that Alice ends up with both of these things, even if Alice is honest. And of course, Alice is, as a broker, she's concerned about her reputation. You know, she, unlike the others who are kind of ephemeral, you know, she's worried that she'll get a reputation of being someone who is unreliable or who steals things. So now she's got to figure out how to return these things in order to preserve her a good name as a broker. And so, you know, that's not acceptable either. One thing that is acceptable is maybe nothing happens. You know, they try, but they're unable to reach a deal, and everybody ends up with where they started. And that's considered acceptable, although it's not preferred. So if we try to do a deal and somehow it breaks and everybody ends up whole, then, well, in real life, this isn't ideal because people paid fees, they had resources locked up for brief periods, so they're not going to be happy, but it's not considered a disaster. We just view this as the price of doing business. So this would be considered an okay outcome, even if we don't like it.
Wait, but you didn't have, I thought you were specifically trying to rule out Bob and Carol finding out each other's identities.
Well, we're sort of assuming that the deal, we're not talking about how the market is set up. Somehow they find each other. You know, maybe Bob and Carol find Alice through Craigslist or something like that.
No, but so I believe there are easy solutions if you don't mind Bob and Carol learning each other's identities. But you said you wanted to prevent them from learning each other.
That would not be considered. All I'm talking about is, in the end, we want the money and the tickets to exchange hands, and we want Alice to get her a fair commission. And I haven't talked about how to do this yet. And the thing to remember is that one outcome that is not acceptable is Alice doesn't get paid.
That wasn't in your list.
Yeah. No. There's lots of other things that are considered unacceptable, but so far the only two acceptable scenarios are everybody gets what they want, or nothing happens, or no assets change. Yeah. But that's a separate issue.
True. After the deal is over, or just while it's happening?
After the deal is over, we're worried about what happens after everything quiets down. If nothing changes, then you say, well, that was a waste of time, but it's not considered a disaster. If after the deal...
Learn each other's identities, then it's a disaster. If basically, like, B or C can make the deal fail in such a way that they learn the other party's identity, that's a bad deal.
Yeah, but that's a question about the mechanism, not about what you're trying to... that would be a failed mechanism. But anyway, I don't want to talk about identities here because that's a distraction from where I'm trying to go with this. Yeah.
This is across different blockchains, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I should mention that the tickets and the coins both live on separate blockchains. You know, this is the future where everything has a blockchain.
Okay.
No, this would be relatively easy if they were all in the same blockchain.
But it's different also. I mean, even if they were in the same blockchain, I always think about sequential, whereas your thing is...
Well, I've been a little bit evasive about what kind of atomicity we want, because I'm going to talk about that at length soon. But the net result is we want to guarantee that everybody is happy at the end, and I'm going to kind of drill down and make that more precise as we go along, because it turns out that actually trying to specify what this means is more complicated than you might think.
And meanwhile, on this separate blockchain that these people live on, other events are happening.
Yeah. So, the idea is that, you have a world with lots and lots of blockchains. Each blockchain has its own resources. We want to trade things that are in different blockchains. We want to do not just, these sort of direct swaps, but we want to do these kind of indirect brokered deals. And, we want to do things like auctions. We want to do complicated second price Dutch, Flemish auctions.
There's a clock that everybody can read.
Well, those are different models. And what I'm studiously avoiding saying whether we're in a synchronous or asynchronous model, because I want to focus on correctness conditions that apply to both. When we talk about mechanisms, which I'm actually not going to talk about in this talk, but Barbara talked about some of that earlier, then the paper has a mechanism that works in a synchronous model, and then the CBC mechanism that works in an asynchronous model.
Just one last question, because we're talking about correctness. So there's randomness here. We're talking about everything's probabilistic.
Everything at this level is not probabilistic yet. So, I'll talk a little bit about finality at the end. Whether when something is finished, is it really done, or is it done with overwhelming probability, that kind of thing.
So Phil and Carol, all these people are not tossing coins?
Are not.
Tossing coins? I mean,
The tickets we assume are certificates that can be redeemed for tickets, and we assume there's some mechanism that means that you can tell whether you have a ticket, and when you bring this ticket to a theater, they actually let you in.
mechanisms could be probabilistic.
The mechanism could be probabilistic if you're willing to live with that. So it could be, at this level of description, it could be either probabilistic or deterministic, where probabilistic means true with overwhelming probability, which is a common thing in the blockchain world.
Right, that's why I'm asking if you are.
So, in general, the focus is we have a bunch of parties and they want to trade assets. That's all they want to do. They want to they have something of value, they want to do these complicated exchanges where they end up with something else of value. And we want to figure out how to make that happen. We want to do things like multi-step transfers. We want to do all these sophisticated financial instruments, including the ticket brokering example where you use money that you don't have to buy something you don't own, and then end up with having done the transfer and collecting a commission. Each asset lives on its own database or blockchain. I'm going to describe this in terms of blockchain, but really, if blockchains went out of business tomorrow, everything I say would still be valid. If you replace blockchains with whatever secure, tamper-proof database technology that would replace it. So this isn't really about blockchains. This is about how you do trading in an environment where nobody trusts each other and you can't enforce anything. Blockchains are a convenient way to implement this, but it's not really essential. And of course, the parties are autonomous. Nobody trusts anybody. Nobody knows who they are. If somebody rips you off, you have no recourse. So it's a harsh environment in that respect. So what I'm going to talk about is that what it means for one of these adversarial commerce deals to be correct. The paper also talks about mechanisms for how to implement this, which I'm not going to have time to talk about. But I'm really going to talk about how we need to rethink classical notions of correctness. So the closest thing to what I'm describing would be a distributed atomic transaction in a database. But classical databases are different because you don't really expect Byzantine behavior from your components. You can often kind of enforce compliance. But here, you can't force anybody to do anything. You say, this is the protocol we should all follow. I can't force you to follow the protocol. I can maybe detect if you deviate from the protocol. But it's a situation where if we do cooperate, it will be to our benefit. But everybody would be perfectly happy to pick everyone else's pocket. And so we need to find a way that allows people to benefit and cooperate, even though we don't know anything about the motives or capabilities of our counterparties. So classical distributed transactions are often described in terms of the so-called acid properties. Now, these acid properties, like all these trilemmas we hear about, don't really hold up well under scrutiny. So basically, these are kind of mismatched, poorly defined properties, a little bit like our friendly trilemmas. But I'm going to use these to drive the narrative because these are familiar to a lot of people. We can kind of skate over some of the inconsistencies and vagaries. So it's a good way to organize the story, but don't take these terms too literally because they're, like I said, if you try to make them precise, there's some difficulties. So these are, every database book in the world says, well, what do transactions do? Well, they satisfy these acid properties. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over each of these properties and talk about how they change when we put them into an adversarial environment. So the old adversary was happy to deal with this. The new adversary is unhappy with this. And the problem with this really starts at the root. So I'm going to give you a failure model. So the idea here is I'm going to say that what could a party do? Well, they could be compliant. That means they take an oath and they stick to it, like these Roman heroes. They say, we're going to follow the protocol and we're going to do exactly what it says. If you don't comply, you could deviate from the protocol, which means you can do anything. So deviating members can do absolutely anything they want, and you can't stop them. And you can't even always detect it. I think that's it. So there are lots and lots of much more elaborate models where we say, well, some of them are Byzantine, and some of them are altruistic, and some of them are crafty and rational. Yeah, and we saw even other more elaborate things in earlier talks today. Now, I don't dispute that there are contexts where these more complicated models make perfect sense, but if you're thinking about adversarial commerce, it doesn't make any sense to say, well, Alice, Bob, and Carol's ticket example, we're going to assume that 51% of them are correct, or 67% are correct. Alice and Bob could be the same person doing a Sybil attack on Carol. So we're not going to make any assumptions about the number of deviating parties. Everybody could be deviating. We can't guarantee, you call up 3 people on Craigslist and say, let's do this swap. You can't assume that at least one of them is correct. So we're going to assume any number of deviating parties, yeah.
Does this include the individual blockchains? So
No, blockchains are not parties.
But you said they can be databases instead of blockchains. So
It's something. They're ledgers of some kind.
if the Bitcoin is on a blockchain and the movie ticket is in a
movie ticket blockchain.
You're still assuming that
Yeah, we're going to assume that the blockchains are live and correct because they're kind of passive elements. So it's perfectly okay that you can assume that 51% of the Bitcoin miners are honest, because otherwise you couldn't do anything. But you can't assume that 51% of the people you're doing your drug deal with are honest.
I guess my question is, when you use a database instead of a blockchain, does that change that assumption?
No. I just use a database to emphasize the fact that this is not a blockchain. I don't care about the blockchain technology at this level. All we care is it's tamper-proof, live, and it does what it's supposed to do. In particular, I don't care about, well, it's not, for the time being, I don't care what flavor blockchain it is, although we're going to need finality at some point.
Can I ask you, what's the difference between the model you have in Allornothing versus Byzantine? Because it seems to me that the guys that pledge to follow the protocol are honest, and the guys that can do anything are Byzantine. So what's the difference?
So the difference is that, so Byzantine corresponds roughly to non-compliant. Because if you're non-compliant, you can do anything. We don't assume that non-compliant are rational. We don't assume anybody's rational. We don't All we say is either you conform to the protocol or you do something else. You know, we're not judging. We're not doing moral.
Yeah, but you want to be safe against any kind of behavior of the other one. So
Yeah,
this is,
yeah.
in other words, Byzantine, as I would also say.
Yeah, no, it's perfectly okay to say that they're Byzantine, but you know, Byzantine could be a synonym for non-compliant. But the problem is, if you say Byzantine, then people say, what about altruistic? What about this and the other thing? So,
Not everyone.
no, I trust you not to be confused about this, but you know, these others. Okay, so first thing is atomicity. You know, atomicity is kind of the coin of the realm in here, and roughly speaking, you know, this is not going to be a formal talk. You know, you say either everything happens or nothing happens. So the net effect is as if everybody got what they wanted, or it's as if, you know, no assets changed hands. And this is what we mean when we say we commit or we abort the transaction. Now, the problem is that it is literally impossible to enforce all or nothing properties in an environment where we have autonomous agents who can do anything they feel like. You know, if nothing else, an incompetent, deviating party might try to steal something, fail, and have its assets slashed. And that's perfectly okay, but that's neither all nor is it nothing. So we need to be much more careful about what we expect to happen, because you might be tempted to say, okay, maybe just it's all or nothing for the conforming parties, but even that doesn't work, because the deviating party might just do an airdrop and give everyone money. And if you require the conforming parties to refuse that, then nobody will, you know, buy your system. So we want to be a little bit more careful about what happens. So let's split this into two subsidiary properties. So we'll say liveness says if everybody conforms, then all the transfers happen. This is sort of the commit case. You know, this is sort of the minimum you want. If everybody behaves and, you know, the network behaves and et cetera, then everything happens. Yeah.
Why do airdrops violate atomicity? Can't you just, the airdrop happens in a separate transaction from...
Well, but then you're going to go down this kind of rat hole and say, well, what about this situation? What about that situation? What about that situation? So we're going to come up with a formulation that says that, you know, the bad guys can do anything they want. And, you know, I'll answer that in like 1 or 2 slides. So if all the parties are conforming, then all of the transfers take place. You know, that's sort of the minimum reasonable liveness property you can ask for. It's also the maximum. Safety, it says if some of the parties deviate, no conforming party ends up worse off. And I know most of you are looking at this term "worse off" with alarm and saying, you know, this looks like, you know, looks like trouble. And I'll say something about what "worse off" means. But the idea is that if you conform, the protocol that you use to do this deal had better ensure that as long as you conform, you can't be cheated. You know, it doesn't say that it guarantees that you get that Carol gets her tickets. But it does guarantee that Carol doesn't end up worse off than when she started.
But does getting a free option from someone, does that count as cheating them or not?
It does.
Getting a free option from someone count as cheating them or not?
It's every party can decide for themselves what it means to be worse off.
So like, suppose I can get you for, you know, for 5 seconds, I can get you to commit to like buying $1 for like, you know, 95 euro cents or something. And then at the end of that second, I can like decide whether I want to do that. That option has value for me. It costs you, you have to like lock up some money. So if that aborts, would you consider yourself worse off?
If it aborts, you're not worse off than you were before. You might be full of regret and gnashing your teeth, but you're not objectively worse off at the end than you were. You know, we're ignoring things like transaction fees and annoyance and time wasting.
But you're also ignoring the time value of money then? Or?
We're ignoring the time value of money in this case because when you're looking at mechanisms, you want to say, oh, you know, the swap is correct according to these criteria, but I don't like it because optionality, because of all these other things. I'm going to treat that as a performance issue which I'm not going to discuss. But these correctness conditions are not the only things that you want. I'm just saying that this is how you transform the baseline classical correctness conditions to make sense in this. There are plenty of other things that you care about. Does this work in a model I consider, if you don't believe in a synchronous model, then does this work in an asynchronous model? Elaine?
I guess I'm also confused about this definition of worse off. Like in the example you gave earlier, you had a set of acceptable conditions. So for that specific example, is the worse off definition the same as the set of acceptable conditions, or there's like a more...
I'm going to go in detail about what are acceptable. In the end, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable is more or less up to the individual. So if you buy tickets and I give you different tickets than the ones I advertised, you can say, oh, these are better tickets than I ordered. Yeah, yes, I'll take it. No, I don't like these tickets. I'm going to abort the deal.
Everyone can specify their utility function?
Everyone knows their own utility function, and they can decide whether to continue or... So for the deal to go through, everybody has to be happy. And anybody can veto the deal. If you're conforming, anybody can veto the deal. If you deviate from the protocol, then we don't care what happens to you. You deserve whatever cruel fate falls on you.
I buy the worse off completely. What I don't understand is the sum. Sum means from one to possibly nearly all?
If anybody other than you, some could be, we have no assumptions about the number of deviating parties. And so if a coalition of deviating parties, conspires against you, they can't make you worse off.
If everyone deviates, it's fine.
If everyone deviates, we don't care, because we only protect the honest conforming parties. So, of course, what do we mean when we say worse off in this case? So I'm going to explain this using kind of cookbook game theory. So I have to admit that everything I know about game theory I learned on the streets. I was never given proper instruction in this stuff. So I'm going to use very kind of simple language, and those of you who know more about game theory should feel free to chime in, and I probably won't be able to ask any questions. I'll refer them to my co-authors. So a deal is a cooperative game. Everybody works together, and you end up with something in the end. You spend things and you receive things. A protocol is just a suggested strategy. So say, okay, everybody, we want to sell these tickets. This is the protocol that you follow. Maybe it involves hash locks, maybe it involves a CBC, maybe, who knows what it involves. Protocol is a strategy. We're going to assume that parties can form coalitions and they commit to a common strategy. This is because there may be Sybil attacks. Some collection of parties may actually be the same party. They may be under the control of the same evil Bond villain, for all we know. The result is called the payoff. So you play this game, you either follow the common strategy and conform, or you deviate from the strategy, and in the end you end up with some kind of payoff. So I'm going to talk about the different payoffs and give them kind of names for classes of roughly equivalent payoffs. Elaine?
Switch their strategy in the middle, or they have to commit to a strategy?
If you can change your strategy in the middle.
So I can look at the transcript of the current execution and then decide to deviate from the...
Yes. Yeah. And if you deviate at any point, you're considered to be deviating. And anybody can deviate at any time. This is why it's important to say from the beginning that any number can deviate. We don't put an assumption. It just doesn't seem realistic to place a limit on the number of deviating parties. So as long as you yourself are honest, the protocol better guarantee that you're not can't end up worse off. So one.
But I don't understand what honest is, because you are saying...
Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. There is no honest. There's conforming or not conforming. And so honest is, I'm making a moral judgment that I shouldn't be doing.
If you were conforming in the beginning and then you change your strategy halfway or vice versa, then are you conforming or not?
No, you're not conforming. To be conforming, you have to conform all the way through. So one is, so this is the party. One outcome is you get paid something, an incoming asset is transferred, but none of the outgoing assets are transferred. So this is called free ride because you're getting something for nothing. That's one possible thing that could happen if the protocol goes wrong. Another one is sort of is what we call discount, which says that all of the incoming assets that I was promised were transferred into my ownership, but only some of my outgoing transfers happened. So in other words, I paid, this was cheaper than I expected. I expected I would get a bunch of incoming assets. I expected I would pay a bunch of outgoing assets. I was okay with that. But turns out I paid less than I expected. That's another class of possible outcomes. A deal is the expected normal outcome where you get all of your incoming assets and you pay all of your outgoing assets. This is classical transaction commits scenario. No deal is classical transaction abort scenario. No assets come in or out. You end up with exactly what you started with. And finally, the one you've been waiting for is some incoming asset is not transferred. You don't get paid everything you want, but some outgoing asset is transferred. So in other words, you weren't paid everything you were promised, but you had to pay yourself. And this is kind of a chaotic outcome. Now, this may or may not be acceptable, probably not. But it says that, I agreed I would be paid this and I agreed I would pay that, but what happened was I got some of this and some of that. And, this is a total mess. So we can kind of...
assumption here that all of your assets have positive utility?
Yeah. No, that is... You can sort of flip it around and flip the arrows around. If I'm unloading toxic waste, then I think I'm not sure what happens if you have both gold and toxic waste in the same transaction, but I'm sure it could be done.
And it's strictly positive, not non-negatives?
It's strictly positive. Because if it's zero, then why bother?
Suppose an asset is worth zero, but you only realize it's worth zero halfway through the transaction.
I'm assuming here that the values are kind of fixed. There are lots of ways you can kind of extend and twiddle with the model, but I want to stick with something simple at this point. Because I'm trying to convince you should be thinking about things this way, and I want to encourage you to go off and add all of these extensions that you can think of. So we want to rank these things. So deal is better than no deal in terms of being better off, because otherwise, why would you agree to do this in the first place if you didn't consider doing the trade better than not doing the trade? If this were the other way around, you wouldn't have signed up for the transaction to begin with. Discount is better than deal because you get the same thing, but you pay less. So, this seems pretty straightforward. Free ride is better than no deal because you didn't pay anything, but you got something. So in this case, you end up unchanged. Here, you're unchanged except you get something extra. And I don't want to argue about whether free ride or a deal are better, because you can think of scenarios that work either way, and it doesn't really matter. And underwater is kind of the chaotic outcome, where some things happen and some other things that don't happen. And what I'm going to say is, well, everything above here is acceptable. So if you end up in any state up here at the end of the deal, then you're no worse off than you were before. And you're actually, in some cases, you must be better off. So this is kind of no worse off, and these are better. This is better off. Underwater is hard to say. This is application dependent. Probably that's not acceptable, but there may be special cases where it is acceptable. So the acceptability of underwater outcomes is application dependent. Like you might say, well, I was expecting to get 3 assets, and I was expecting to spend 3 other assets, but if I get 2 and I pay 2, I'm okay with that as well. So that would be acceptable. Or you might say, well, that's not acceptable. I want the full deal or nothing at all. And so you can design, your protocols can take either of those into account.
So those states are global states of the execution. They're not defined, are they defined individually?
No, they are individual.
So every player can have some can go up and some can go down.
Yeah. So at the end, this is from the point of view of an individual party. You can say, I'm happy with this outcome because I got everything I asked for, or I got more than I asked for. at the end of the same deal, you might say, I'm totally unhappy with this because I paid and I didn't get anything. So this is from your point of view, and it's also particularly with these underwater things, that's your individual choice. So all of these protocols are going to have a stage where you look at the outcome and say, am I happy with this? Yes, I want to proceed. No, I don't like this outcome. I'm pulling the plug. And this reflects the fact that nobody trusts anybody else. Everybody has to make their own decision everybody has their own objective function that only they know.
Why this cannot be formulated as old school distributed task?
Because old school distributed tasks didn't think about these kinds of. We are using tricks from old school distributed tasks, but we're putting them together in a new way.
Talking about what I start with and what I'm willing to end, what is acceptable that I will end up with. So why it's different than what we're doing? Because you are having some.
People have been doing this since the ancient Babylonians, but we have blockchains. So, but one technical assumption I'm going to put here is that acceptability is monotonic. If I view an outcome as being satisfactory, it's also satisfactory if I get more or I pay less. Yeah.
So you use the term acceptability here, but this is individual. So this
individual, yes.
So this is sort of a definition of worse off, right?
Yes, exactly. This is exactly the definition of worse off.
So is underwater always required to be below no deal, or you're saying that is application dependent?
That is application dependent. In practice, I think it's almost always going to be below no deal. There might be special cases where you can say, well, I negotiated a really good deal, something fell apart, but I can still get an okay deal. And we don't want to rule that out, but it's really kind of a marginal. If you rule it out, then people will say, oh, but you're too inflexible. If we let it in, people say, well, that never happens. Yes?
Is there any reason to discretize these states? Like, can I think of it as a zero-sum game where initially every player has some, let's say, value, and then the protocol redistributes the value, and then you can clearly define each player's utility by the difference between the values?
You can do that, except I don't think it's a zero-sum game.
In what sense is it not?
If you and I are trading something, we both have to feel we're better off. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing the trade. So it's not zero-sum, but it is a game in that sense.
You could encode this in the utility of the different buyers, right? So
yeah.
Buyer's utility, which would find it good to get the tickets, and the seller's utility wants cash.
Oh yeah. So I've been we made a deliberate attempt to avoid using utility functions and kind of argue on a more informal level. But you could totally go in and put utility functions and Greek letters on all of these things. But we're trying to make an effort to be intuitive, but at heart you're right. This is how you would do it if in other cultures. Okay, consistency. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit. So consistency is kind of the odd person out here. This has to do with application-specific constraints are respected. This is, to my mind, kind of a confused property, which I think is put in there only so they could make the ACID acronym. So I'm going to use this as a way to sneak in application-specific considerations. And the idea here is that, let me remind you what a strong Nash equilibrium is. I'm sure some of you know this better than I do. The idea is there's a default strategy that everyone is requested to follow. But if some coalition deviates, some coalition commits to deviating together, then it won't improve its payoff. So following the default strategy is a strong Nash equilibrium if it satisfies this property. And so because that's a lot of words, I'll just say that the protocol is a strong Nash equilibrium, although technically that doesn't make sense. So conforming to the protocol should be a strong Nash equilibrium because otherwise no one is going to follow it. Here, for example, is a diagram where everybody has some kind of asset that they want to trade with everyone else. For example, Alice wants to send Bitcoin to Felix. And there's a theorem that you can prove that if we have a protocol that ensures that no conforming party ends up underwater, That's a strong Nash equilibrium if and only if this directed graph is strongly connected. And I'm not going to prove that here because I don't have time to prove it, but what I'll say is that if it's false, then there's some subgraph that absorbs assets but doesn't produce them. So assets transferred from here go there, but nothing comes back. And so a strong Nash equilibrium, you would say, well, I'm going to defect and just not send this asset and pretend I did. And now I'm better off. These people can't complain because they can't communicate with anyone. And so then that's a kind of a moral hazard. So the better payoff to defect, so it's clearly not any kind of Nash equilibrium. If the digraph is strongly connected and a coalition this is the other direction, it achieves a better payoff by deviating, then we can prove that some conforming party must be underwater. And again, I'm not going to prove that, but you can if you want.
Being strongly connected, does that mean just everyone is within a circle, a cycle?
Yeah, it means given any two vertices, there's a directed path from one to the other.
So they're equivalent. The two equivalent.
Yeah. Everybody's on a cycle.
Yeah.
No, because I think you can be on. You could have disconnected graph with two cycles that's not strongly connected. So it's got to be every vertex can reach every other vertex.
So does this mean the model can't accommodate like exogenous, like if I do some work for you?
If I buy lunch from you and you're going to call the police and put me in jail if I don't pay you, then that would not be strongly connected if you look only at the payment. That's because there's a hidden payment. Your sandwich, the sandwich that you gave me, isn't shown on the graph. So yeah, we don't. We're assuming that all value transfers happen on blockchains. You can generalize it to say, well, maybe we have hidden transfers too, but just technically because we want to keep things simple, we're assuming that everything is all asset transfers happen on some chain.
But there's more to life than asset transfers, or is the assumption here?
Any model, there's more to life than any formal model.
It's trading on blockchain all day.
Okay, isolation. This says no transaction sees in other intermediate states. This is where we get serializability and things like that from. In the blockchain world, serializability doesn't make any sense because if you look at things like timed hash lock protocols, they're interacting through these kind of cautious steps where I'll do something and wait until you do something and then you do something, like these old cowboy movies. So serializability isn't the analog of isolation in this case. What is the analog is escrow, is a lot like locking a data structure. So in order to convince you I'm serious about giving you the money for the tickets, I need to put my coins in escrow. In order to convince you that I'm serious about selling the tickets, I need to put the tickets in escrow. And the meaning of escrow, if I can revoke the escrow and grab the money and run, then you probably shouldn't be doing a deal with me. So the equivalent of isolation is basically that assets placed in escrow can't be unlocked until the deal is complete. And by unlocked, I mean either refunded or transferred to the counterparty. You're not allowed to move things around out of escrow in the middle of a deal in a way that pulls out the rug from the deal.
So this is a theorem you proved, or it's an assumption?
No, this is a definition. This is what, if you can revoke escrow in the middle of a deal, then it's not an escrow.
You're saying that it is impossible to construct these deals without escrow. So that's something you would need to prove, or it's...
I'm saying that I believe that's true, but I'm not willing to prove it. I'm just going to assume it here. Yeah.
But I don't understand. Serializability is a condition. Locking or freezing.
Locking is a mechanism. Locking is but serializability as a condition doesn't make any sense in this context because the parties are interacting through this kind of incremental mistrusting. It's like in these movies where they exchange Cold War spies across a bridge. You can't send one spy over and then send the other spy because the second person would just keep their own spy. So you have to do these kind of interactive things, which is not serializable because everybody can see everyone else.
So I just wanted to say that one of the reasons why these asset properties are so confusing is because they are putting together semantic constraints and implementation constraints. And so something like isolation really has more to do, and consistency for that, no, not consistency, consistency is a semantic constraint, but isolation is actually a constraint on the implementation of the database. And they're lumped together. And that's why it's really confusing.
Yeah, no, I totally endorse that. Of course, the other is aliveness. Assets can't be locked up forever.
Do we really have to think in terms of assets and escrows, or can we just think in terms of the edges that are connecting two things and the transaction they represent somehow?
I think it depends on the level that you want to think. I think Barbara's right that here we're kind of mixing mechanism with semantics in some sense. And this is this is a side effect of driving the narration through this already slightly level confused terminology. Okay, final thing is durability. This is the easier one. So durability basically says committed transactions survive crashes. Now talking about mechanism here, this is a world where main memory is volatile, disks are non-volatile. Disks are slow and expensive, so we've got to run around, writing things out to disks and so on. But really, what this says is that if you say something committed, then it doesn't go away. Which is basically the same as finality. You don't reorg the database. And if you buy into the libertarian Kool-Aid, this says we also censorship by regulators, corporations, hackers, counterparties, and so on. But I think our friends at Calibra are discovering that these romantic ideas of censorship resistance, when you meet with the need to satisfy regulators, the outcome is can be confusing. Okay, so let me wrap up here since I'm running out of time. So what I wanted to do here was to talk about the post-blockchain world. It's ambiguous. It could be post-invention of blockchain. It could be the post-discovering that blockchains aren't going to solve the world's problems after all. But again, this notion of adversarial commerce, the idea that untrusted parties need to find a way to cooperate with each other to their mutual benefit, despite the fact that they can't enforce rules or trust one another, is basically here to stay. And whether the technology is blockchains or something that we haven't imagined yet, or more likely something we haven't imagined yet that will be called blockchains when it's deployed, requires rethinking correctness. Because how are we going to prove that our smart contracts are correct if we are confused about what it is they're supposed to accomplish? And so, I started out with this sort of classical formulation of atomic transactions. Again, the ACID properties are not ideal, but it's a little bit like a QWERTY keyboard. Everybody thinks they understand it, so it's easier to explain things in those terms. And then I've talked about new properties for which we haven't found a cool name yet, where we basically use these sort of game theoretic techniques or game theoretic terminology and basically you guarantee that if you conform to the protocol, you don't end up worse off. And most of the other properties kind of follow from that simple requirement. That's it.
I'm fascinated by this potential theorem that you are cautious to say you don't know how to prove, but you believe is right. That there is no way you can do the same without an escrow mechanism. And how would you go on trying to prove something like this?
I think you might be able to prove it using, you can prove almost anything of this nature. There's this FLP approach where you say, well, in order to, one thing we can prove, for example, that what Barbara mentioned is you can use an FLP-like argument to show that if you're in an asynchronous world, there has to be a single blockchain that receives all the commits. So in the same way, if I can release if I can transfer an asset out after promising it to someone else, then presumably you can cheat somebody by transferring it out immediately before you commit. So it's got to be something that prevents you from doing that. And I bet that kind of argument can be made precise, although I can't do it on the spot.
But you could always sort of, whatever the other payout is, you could always go and abort that one and get proof to release your escrow rate. To me, escrow implies that there's some period of time during which I lose control of my asset, even if the thing's going to fail. But if I can pull the plug at any point, then that's not really escrow. It's just like, yeah, I was willing to participate in the deal until I got bored.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that part of the challenge here is defining formally what escrow means. And what you're pointing out is that it's not entirely obvious what escrow means in this case. I mean, it's a little like saying, can I do an atomic transaction without putting locks on data? And, there's optimistic techniques where you don't lock the data, but when time comes to commit, if the data is been corrupted, then you don't go through. So I think, there are, there's a lot of challenges.
Different from escrow, and maybe complicated so you wouldn't want to do it, but worth not ruling out.
I bet I can prove that you need something called escrow if I get to define what escrow is. Yeah.
How is this described technique different from the classic atomic swap with HTLCs for Bitcoin?
Because there's two things. One is that in the paper we describe a protocol that is based on HTLCs, but it's not an atomic swap, because you can't. That ticket brokering example is not a swap.
But the whole point is that you don't need a broker in the first place. You use the blockchain as the intermediary.
But the economics of the world are that it's more efficient if you have a broker who sells tickets. If I want to buy a theater ticket, I don't walk down the street to each theater and buy a ticket. I go on to Ticketmaster and buy tickets, and I'm perfectly happy to pay a commission to Ticketmaster. So if you want to support a modern economy, you have to be able to support this kind of indirect brokering and these complicated things that cannot be expressed as swaps. Swaps are, if I have a chicken and you have a goat, we can do a swap. But if I want to buy a theater ticket in Los Angeles, I've got to go through an intermediary and do something like what I described.
I'm not convinced that it's not basically the same mechanism as an atomic swap. It's just that on the two chains, Alice and Bob and then Alice and Carol are the ones forming the transactions with the HTLCs. Alice doesn't contribute anything to either transaction, but then everything sort of proceeds as it normally would in an atomic swap. Am I wrong about that?
No, when you say that Alice doesn't contribute anything, that's a radical critique of modern capitalism, because she's making the market for them.
I mean, literally in the outputs and the HTLC, she does not put in any assets.
Yeah, but I wouldn't do it that way because it's too easy to for them to cheat and cut out the middleman. So you want to set these things up so that Alice gets her commission. Otherwise, Bob and Carol are perfect. If they knew how,
It seems like there's some kind of privacy thing going on here that I don't quite understand. Because
privacy is kind of a mechanism. I'm talking about outcomes.
Finding out about each other. Otherwise, you could just use the traditional atomic swap machinery, I think.
Yeah, no, but if you tried to reduce this to atomic swaps, what you would end up with is you would have Bob and Carol swapping, and then Alice would be sending one coin, and that's not strongly connected. And so by the theorem I showed you, there's that's not a strong Nash equilibrium, and Bob and Carol would just totally cheat and cut out Alice.
The other thing here is the middleman could end up with something that they didn't want.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's precisely what he seems to be trying to avoid. In HTLC, you can
but you can bridge multiple HTLCs like a network style and with implementing time locks and get.
Oh yeah. No, we have a protocol where we use multiple HTLCs, but to implement the deal, but it's not a swap protocol.
How is it not a swap protocol? If A sends to B and B sends to C atomically, B is the intermediary.
That's not. I'm defining a swap as a direct transfer from me to you.
Yes.
And that's it. But if it's me to you and you to a third, and you take that same asset and send it to a third party, then it's not a swap.
Why not?
Because that's not what swap means.
We have different definitions.
Yeah. So I'm defining a swap this way.
From a practical perspective, like from a merchant to payer perspective, what is the actual difference?
So The actual difference is that the swap protocols that were published and called themselves swap protocols, including ones that I wrote, you can only do one-hop direct transfers.
How is that? Like Lightning Network does multi-hop, like for...
It does one hop at a time. Lightning is not a swap protocol.
It's a question of naming. Okay, you can say that Lightning is not a swap protocol, but...
So Lightning does a multi-hop HTLC. That's not what he's looking for.
I understand, but you can do cross-chain Lightning payments.
You can do,
It's a cycle.
No, I'm not saying that nobody has ever done these things before. I'm saying that this is not a trivial extension of swaps. You need new machinery and new concepts in order to talk about this, because if you look at published papers on swaps, it's all direct payments from here to there, that's it. And I'm saying if you do anything more than that, then you should no longer call it a swap. It's something different. You might not be happy with that terminology, but I'm going to bang my fist on the table and say, that's what it means.
Isn't the point that you can actually set up that game in a way that it's advantageous to all players to not disintermediate the broker? That's what you're achieving, right?
Yeah. So that is, it's not. It might be advantageous to the players to disintermediate the broker if they could. So you want to set up the.
Your protocol is such that it's not in their best interest to do so.
It's not in their best, because if they're caught cheating, they'll lose.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't think payment networks or anything are dealing with this thing. You can connect where you want, and there's no attempt to protect the broker. But you do, if I understand well.
Yeah, I'm not sure who would qualify as a broker in a payment network. Yeah.
Why do you say there is no attempt to protect the broker? I mean,
So
payment networks, the intermediaries cannot lose money, right?
Sorry?
In the payment networks, the intermediaries, so Alice in this case, she cannot lose money. Like payment network guaranteed.
Protecting, yeah, sure. But here, Alice is entitled to have some commission according to the goal of the protocol. And somehow, if I understand correctly, the Nash equilibrium is set up in a way that it's going to be in the best interest of every player, if the deal concludes at all, to actually pay that commission to the middle person, the Alice in this case. And I think that's a new question, and it's a solution to a slightly different question. Would you agree?
I mean, it could be, because I think Lightning Network was not analyzed in like game theoretic way. So could be that that's the main difference actually.
So okay, I'm glad I provoked a discussion, but I don't want to leave everyone else sitting here with refreshments and bathrooms and so on out there. So thanks again.